Hi, my name is Pastor Hal York, and welcome to Truth in the Trenches. We're going to be in James chapter 4, verses 1 to 3 in the next few weeks, over the next few weeks, and we're going to look at verse 1 today. I'll read those in a few minutes. But James is a book about tests of a living or a real faith. Tests are those things that bring out the real me, show who I really am. Trials, the people he's writing to are being dispersed, separated from family and friends because of persecution. And all of those things constitute tests. We spent the last few weeks looking at the characteristics of earthly wisdom or fleshly wisdom versus the wisdom that is from above. And I want to read those to remind us again of what they look like, because we'll see that they're very much in tune with what James is going to lead us into in chapter 4. James 3:13 to 18. If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you'll find disorder and every kind of evil. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. And so we're going to look in James chapter 4 in a few minutes, but just think about those verses we just read, and think about the verses preceding those that deal with the tongue and the power the tongue has to do good or do evil, the power the tongue has to control our whole life. But I think these verses point out, and the ones we're going to look at today, the idea that the early church was an ideal church. It was a perfect church. And that's not an accurate depiction of the early church. We need to become a New Testament church, and that will take care of all of our problems, is a delusion. The problem with the early church was people attended it, broken people, imperfect people. Tares were planted in the early church, and the church today is no different, because people are no different. The battles are no different. The heart is not different. Tares are still being sown in the church. The flesh still battles against the spirits. So we should not be shocked when we read verses like we're going to read in verses 1 to 3. Let me read them for you. James 4, 1 to 3. Now remember, this follows what he just said about the tongue and about wisdom. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire, do not have. You murder, you covet, and cannot obtain. So you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your pleasures. So obviously this church, these people that James is writing to, this church James is writing to, is not a perfect church. It sounds like a church very much alive and well in the 21st century. But he begins the chapter by asking some questions. And that's always an important thing to do when you're dealing with these kinds of things. He's just told us about two kinds of wisdom. There's the light. He talks about the dangers of an uncontrolled tongue. Now let's take that light and shine it into our own lives and our hearts and our relationships, and use that light to try and diagnose some of the problems that are going on in this assembly or church or family or marriage or wherever. There are very spiritually sounding people who do not produce spiritually healthy environments. They are deemed spiritual because they tell you they are spiritual. And so what he's talking about in verses 1 to 3 should not surprise us, is not surprising, because we see it everywhere today. We've seen it, it's been part of the church since the church was formed 2,000 years ago. So let's examine the wisdom being demonstrated, not by the eloquence of the speaker or the acceptableness of it in our culture, but by the consequences it produces in the lives of those who practice it. What's going on here in these verses? It is evident, even though those involved may argue to the contrary, that the wisdom being acted out is worldly wisdom. Remember the fruits in verses 16? For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. And so the first question he asks is, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? The plural of these words indicate that these quarrels were not isolated but chronic problems. Quarrels indicates the state of hostility, fights, the specific outbursts of hostility or conflict. The source is ultimately pride. Pride fights, pride gets angry when it doesn't get its own way. And before you go on, let me answer that question. I realize it's a hypothetical question, but let me answer it this way. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Among you and your friends, or you and your spouse, or you and your kids, or your people in the church? What would you hear today? Well, you might hear things like, well, my parents were always fighting and they passed it on to me, or my parents were mean to me, or I always had to look out for myself, or I'm a victim of abuse of some kind. People never take me seriously, so I need to speak up. It's just my temperament. I'm a fighter. I can't help it. I'm passionate about what is right. It's not my fault that I just happen to be always right. People who don't fight get walked over. And so I've learned to be a fighter, and we justify it. That's why we get quarrels and fights among us, or so we think. So James here is talking about the personal conflicts that can blight church life, family life, fellowship, marriage, friendships. They suck the joy out of life. They suck the life out of life. Wars and fightings among you, not with outsiders, but among believers. People we're called to love, family and friends. And I think James here is not just talking in generalities. He's being specific. You is best understood as referring to the readers of the letter, not them or they, but you. You people reading this letter, why are there wars and fights among you? He's writing to help people understand the people who've been displaced and dispersed from their families. So he's not generalizing. He's speaking to specific things going on in their world. Where two or three are gathered, there's going to be a difference of opinion about something. Where two or three are gathered, there is pride and the brokenness of our sin. Nature's looking for a fight. And no one's scratching heads there listening and asking, what's he talking about? So he's asked a question, and now he begins to answer it. Why are you always fighting? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? So he points his finger at the problem, their passions and their pleasures. The unpleasant fact is that this quarreling and arguing and fighting arises out of your pleasures or passions that were in your members, not somebody else's passion, yours. In other words, the trouble is not outside of you and I, in our environment, which is beyond our control. The problem is in our own self-seeking attitudes. Pleasures or passions speak to the enjoyment derived from the fulfillment of our own desires or the craving of pleasure itself. What's the ultimate pleasure in life? Well, that might be different for every person. But I really think at the bottom, the ultimate pleasure is getting our own way, is doing what we want. George Foreman has said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And sometimes the biggest punch in the face someone can experience in this day and age is not getting their own way, not being catered to. So many fights and wars are fought on this battlefield of rights and feelings and expectations not met. War is declared on the parents, the siblings, the church, the boss, the government. Why? Because of these passions and pleasures that war within us. The problems stem from strong desires to please ourselves, to the yearning of self-love that still clings to us through our flesh. A self-love that's seen as in our today as a virtue in our modern culture. And many believers as well believe that, sadly. So the war. Picture these pleasures carrying out a campaign aimed at getting satisfaction of their particular craving. As opposed to verse 7. What's verse 7 says? So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. He talks about peace, pursuing peace in verse 6. That the ultimate choice in life lies between pleasing oneself and pleasing God. So what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is it not the source is not the source your pleasures that war in your members? We said earlier that that source and our pleasures are fueled by pride. Verse 1 describes where the source of our wars. Verse 2 describes this war in our members, obsessed with getting our own way, because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasure. So the subject in these verses is our pleasures, our desires. The source of our war is the pleasures. We ask with wrong motives that we can spend it on our pleasures, verse 3. And so our source, the motives to spend it on our pleasures, we're obsessed with pleasure. It's motivated, fueled by pride, fueled by the flesh. And so that's what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. The answer to the question is, what is causing quarrels and fights among you? Do they not come from the evil desires at war within you? When you're trying to help somebody with an anger problem, with a fighting problem, they can't seem to get along with anybody. They're always arguing and fighting and quarreling. James is very honest and very direct here. He doesn't point to anybody else. He says, listen, out of the heart come the issues of life. Out of the heart comes what's really in there. And what's really in the heart of these people? Pleasures. They're seeking their own pleasures. They're seeking their own way. They're doing what is right in their own eyes, and people are standing in their way. So that's what's causing the quarrels and fights among you. They come from the evil desires at war within you. What do those evil desires look like? We'll look at that next time, Lord willing. But James is being painfully practical here. Painfully. Because he's telling us to look at our own selves. When we argue, when we fight, when we dispute, and it may not be an outward knockdown, drag-out fight, but when we're constantly wrestling with these tensions of anger and quarreling, the issue is not the other person. The issue is not everybody else. James points the issue, and the issue is what's going on in my heart. What am I pursuing? So we'll look at that a little more next time, Lord willing. But may this truth guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live our lives for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.